So for any of you who saw my earlier talk, I kind of was explaining how we run our coral restoration nursery. What I didn't explain is we got into the restoration business very differently than most other jurisdictions. We came into it because we were dealing with short-term human-caused impacts that we were trying to hold people accountable for. And the recoveries of settlements, penalties, et cetera, that we were getting weren't being applied to actually restoring or doing proper compensatory mitigation. So the coral nursery that we developed is one part of a three-part model that we use for dealing with these types of actions. And now we're expanding it into things like climate change and other things. To do that, we needed a tool that we could evaluate services and functions. We developed a very good tool for Hawaii, and we've now modified that through the International Coral Reef Initiative and some other partners into a universal tool that can be used anywhere in the world. And as I said, we were coming at it from a different angle. We wanted a tool that could be used for both planned and unplanned impacts, and we needed a tool that was extremely transparent and easy to use, because oftentimes we were dealing with lawyers and decision makers and responsible party representatives who already were coming at it very aggressively from the other side. And so we wanted to have something that would work and we could start a good dialogue to get settlement going. And we were primarily developing it, like I said, for short-term human-caused impacts. Now, I'm going to take a second to explain this, because this actually gets to the root of everything. Okay, so if you look at the axis on the left, and you see where it says baseline prior to injury, that's in regards to services and functions that your reef is providing, okay, and it's at some level. And then you have an impact, and as I said, when we designed this, it was designed for things like vessel groundings, oil spills, but you could apply it to climate change, a bleaching event, whatever you want, a COTS outbreak. And you're going to suddenly get a dramatic drop in your services and functions for that reef. And during the time period that whatever impact is occurring is in place, you're not going to have a start to recovery. It's going to stay stabilized or even dip down a little bit more. And then as you remove whatever's causing that impact, you're going to get a slow recovery based upon the rate at which your reef recovers back to its original state. And it's the area within, that yellow portion, that represents the lost services and functions. And that's what you need to try to replace. But the problem is, for most actions, historically, at least in the US, when you dealt with things like big vessel groundings, they weren't doing this. What they were doing was going out and stabilizing the reef or planting corals. And really what you were doing was you were filling up the area, you were increasing your cover, but you weren't replacing those lost services, because you were making the assumption that if I put a bunch of small stuff out there or cement together a bunch of coral, over time it'll get big enough and replace exactly what was there. And we lost that whole area, that whole yellow area of lost services and functions. And in regards to a resource management agency like mine, that represents a loss to the public. And in the case of Hawaii, where we have really slow-growing corals, we're talking 100, 200 years often. And so it's generations that will be without those services and functions. And that's just the public side. We're not even talking about the ecological side. Let's just explain that. So what am I talking about when I talk about services and functions? For those of you that are familiar with this, these are services and functions that corals provide on a reef. You can break it up into 4 subgroups, 2 functions, 2 services. And the interesting thing is, you can, in a very, very simplistic manner, you can quantify this. And if you can quantify it, you can create a model. And if you can create a model, you now have a way of creating a currency for equating damages to restoration or damages to compensatory mitigation. And so that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to take the services and functions, quantify them, create a model, do it at the level of coral colonies, and then be able to sum that for any damaged habitat in order to figure out what was lost, and then come up with projects, either compensatory mitigation projects or direct restoration projects, to replace that in an equitable manner. And so we need to create a tool. That tool was one part of a 3-part program, which consisted of a way of replacing the coral, that's our nursery, the tool, which is our way of measuring loss and measuring gain, and then we needed a mechanism to work with responsible parties in order to pay for the whole thing. And what we did is we created a mitigation bank. And basically, this is it in a nutshell. And what you have is start at 1, that's our coral nursery. We go out, we grow corals, we restore areas, we document it very carefully, and then the results of that documentation go into this coral tool, which is shown in the yellow box at 2, and it's evaluated by an outside party, usually another government agency. And from that evaluation, they establish a number of credits that restoration or compensatory mitigation project is worth. So we'll come up with, we restore, a half acre, it's worth 10 credits or something. Then, either with an unplanned event or with a planned event, you have some impact. Same way, you go out, you evaluate that impact using the same tool, the same evaluative agency independently evaluates that impact using the tool and establishes how many credits the responsible party needs to buy to offset for the damages caused. At that point, that agency is no longer involved, and now it's a direct interaction between the person selling the credits and the person who needs to buy the credits. They know how many they need to buy, we know how many we have to sell, and we set the price for that. Now, if you're a for-profit, you can set that price really high. But I'm a government agency, so we're restricted. We tend to have to break it down as to what our costs are and what our development issues are. And so we had to develop a tool to do that. It looks something like this. It's just a quick representation. But it's the parameters that go into that tool. And this gets us back to coral cover. And I'm not trying to knock, coral cover is great for monitoring. But from an assessment standpoint, it's horrible. And if you're trying to deal with things like lost services and functions, think about it. I can have 90% cover with an encrusting coral and 10% cover with a small branching species. Services and functions are completely non-comparable. Likewise, you go out and you measure something, you say it's 40% cover. How do I say what those services and functions are? So instead, what we do is we've come up with a method to very, very quickly go out and categorize the form, the size, and where possible, the species of the corals that are at the site, either that were impacted or that are proposed for restoration. And with that information, we now can say something about services and functions. To do that, it has to be fast and cheap, and what we've done is using assessment models that are used for vessel groundings. We send people out with PVC pipe, which is very inexpensive, wrapped every 10 centimeters, every alternate 10 centimeters with black electrical tape, and that gives us a quick measurement scale. And then we size all the corals into one of 8 categories, 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 80, 80 to 160, and greater than 160 centimeters. And the reason it doubles is so that you have the ability to scale up and down between coral sizes for your restoration project. And then you go out and a trained person, actually, even I've used undergrads. It's very easy to do this. It's very fast. It's a very efficient way of categorizing a damaged area or an area to be restored. But to do that, we had to create the model. The model has some basic assumptions, and these are really self-evident, but I'll walk you through them. So the first assumption in the model is that different forms of coral have different ecological service and function values. And if you just think of a wave impacting or going across a reef face, encrusting corals are going to be affected by that wave very differently than massive corals or branching corals. So it's a really obvious statement. The second one is that for the same species of corals and the same form of corals, different sized corals will obviously have different values and functions that they provide. A large, massive coral provides very different functions than a small, massive coral. So that's pretty self-evident. The third one, one other thing about size is size also tells us something about temporal value. And most people understand temporal value if I use terms like, comparing saplings with old growth redwoods or really large old trees compared to a whole bunch of small little trees. There's a value intrinsic in the age of that organism and what it represents. Think of growth rings, etc. So that's another aspect we get out of measuring size. Oops. Oh. The next one's a little harder to understand, and that's rarity. And on a reef, it's very easy to determine rarity for species or forms of coral. But you got to think about it a little bit, because you would think if something's rare, it shouldn't have that many functions because it's not there in that much numbers. But actually, there is. There's a social value to rarity. We, as humans, we value rare things more than we do common things. But there's also an ecological perspective to rarity, because when you have something that's rare on a coral, especially with corals, there tend to be a variety of organisms that are uniquely associated with those rare organisms. And so that loss of that rare organism can have a much larger effect than a similar size loss of a common organism, ecologically. And so rarity itself involves a value. Okay, and then endemism. Now, if you're in a place where you have less than 1% endemism, it'll zero out. You don't got to worry about this in terms of the model. But I'm from Hawaii. We used to think we had 22% endemism of corals. We now realize it's around 25 or 26% endemism. And that means any impact to an endemic coral, we have no replacement pool. There's nowhere we can go to get that species to replace what we've lost. So there is, similar to rarity, there's an intrinsic value to endemism. And then finally, the last one has nothing to do with the coral. It has to do with what the coral is found on, and that's the habitat type or subhabitat type. And quickly, just to get this across to you, if I had the same species of coral, the same size, the same form, one colony is growing on a pier piling, the other colony is out on a reef face, on a reef crest. Right? The one on the pier piling is doing nothing. It's providing no services against wave action. One on the reef crest is. So there is a distinctive and measurable difference between your habitat types relative to your coral. So we built that into the model. And let's just do that. So this is the model. It's very simple. And we wanted it simple, we wanted it transparent. And basically what it says is that your characterization value, your ecological characterization value, is equal to two aspects of what you measure. The first being the habitat type, the second being characteristics associated with each coral colony. F is form, the form of the colony. Is it branching? Is it massive? Is it encrusting as an adult? The size of the colony in one of those size categories I told you. And then the last three require some knowledge about the species. But is it rare? Rarity. E is endemism. And G is just a placeholder for does it grow really, really, really slowly. And this applies mostly to massive corals and a couple other unusual forms. And then there's a couple quick secondary assumptions, which is that when we measure a coral quickly, we're doing the longest diameter because it's a fast measurement. Size is relative. You get some corals that only get to a fixed size and they won't get any bigger. For example, certain fungi. And that in cases where you have multiple forms, like Porites, in the same species, you could have an encrusting form, a massive form, a digiform. You take the one that's most conservative and run it through the model. And this is what the model looks like. And basically, we had to make it very transparent because we were approaching this from a legal perspective of taking people to court. So when you run the model, when you run it for each of your corals, it'll come up with a characterization value. And what you're seeing here, the circle, that's telling me those are all the corals of that species that are in the 5 to 10 centimeter category. And I get this number. And if you just click on this number, oh, I didn't mention, this model is in Excel, so it can be used almost anywhere in the world. It's a very simple form of Excel. You click on that cell, and it will tell you every single factor that was used to multiply to create that. So it's easy, it's transparent, it's easy to check. It eliminates all the arguments that we usually have with responsible parties when you're dealing with them in court. And then it puts out a bunch of information. It tells you it by size, it tells you it sum by size, it tells you the number of colonies, characterization value, etc. And it plots it out for you so that you, especially for me when I'm dealing with decision makers, judges, and responsible party representatives, visuals work better than numbers. And then it sounds complicated, but this is as easy as it is. It's only 4 steps, really. The first step is you fill in some background information. You can only fill in the yellow sections. The rest are locked. A lot of it is pull-down menu, so you click and you select the one that works for you. It will self-populate with certain, as you fill in information, it'll populate it for you so you can save the unique version. And then step 2 is you got to tell something about the habitat type. And we break it down into 3 types, and then within each there's a pull-down menu, so you select your specific habitat type. And then you populate it with coral information. And basically, it's rather simple. You give a name. You can give any name you want. You use the pull-down menu to select the form, and it will use a color code for the rest of it so it keeps it tracked. You answer a question from a pull-down menu about rarity, and you answer a question about endemism and slow growth, and that's it. And then all you gotta do is put in the numbers from the corals you counted, based on those size ranges. And after you're done, it will give you its results, and you can use those results. And these are the ways we use it. And so really quickly, because I'm running out of time, I want to give you a real example. So this is a harbor project that's going on right now. This harbor project just got me $3.3 million for a coral nursery. Okay, and it was primarily because of the way we use this tool. So they went out, the areas in yellow on the picture is what they're dredging and filling. They sent their own people out. They went and measured the sizes of the corals, the species of corals, and the form of corals. And they gave us the data, we put the data into the tool, and it spit out that they're going to destroy 82,157 colonies for this project, and that the ecological characterization value is 114,130, okay? We then looked at the graph to see the range of corals and what we needed to produce. We determined how many corals we were going to have to grow in the nursery to replace that. And the take-home message is, if you look at this, you see I only have to grow 212 corals to replace all 82,000 that are going to be lost. And the reason for that is I'm growing the corals larger, so they have far higher services and function values. I'm growing exactly the same species in roughly the same distributions that were there, but I'm putting them onto natural reefs, not back into a harbor on man-made structures. So I gain a big advantage in services and functions by putting them onto natural reefs. This saves the responsible party a lot of money, and from the state's perspective, as the resource trustee, we would rather see natural reefs restored than putting corals onto artificial substrates in order to mitigate for that loss. So we gain, the public gains, and the public gets those lost services and functions back within a single year, as opposed to decades to centuries. So that's basically it. And that's not important. This is just reiterating how we use the tool. My last slide is, if you want to try this out, okay, we'll provide copies of this tool to anybody who wants it. All you have to do is send me your email to this email address, and I'll send you a copy of the tool. It's in Microsoft Excel. And all I ask is, if you do find any bugs, because it was designed for Hawaii, we modified it so it could be used anywhere, please let us know, and we'll make it better for everybody else. Thank you.